They told me the archive on Velacara station had burned in the purge. They lied. I found it intact, sealed behind 7 layers of quantum encryption, the kind that takes the average species 3 centuries to crack. It took me 11 days. I am human. That should have been their first warning. My name is Sarah Voss. I am a xenoarchaeologist, which is a complicated word for someone who digs through the ruins of civilizations that would rather she didn't. I have spent 14 years working in the outer rim of the Keth expanse, cataloging sites that every other species in the galactic conclave politely avoids. They avoid it because it is dangerous. I work here because dangerous places tend to have better secrets. Velacara station is old, older than the conclave itself, according to some records. It hangs in a dead orbit around a collapsed sun, gray and silent, its docking rings half-eaten by micrometeorite damage. My research vessel, the Persistent Question, looked almost embarrassingly small clamped to its outer hull. Most species who pass through this region of space take one look at Velacara and keep going. I had spent 6 months convincing my university to fund the trip. My assistant on this particular expedition was a Thraxi scholar named Kun Vel. The Thraxi are a tall, four-armed people with wide amber eyes and a deep, instinctive fear of what they call unguarded knowledge, information that exists without a keeper to control its use. Kun Vel was brilliant and careful and deeply unhappy about most of the decisions I made on a daily basis. He followed me into the station's lower archive level, carrying a portable scan unit and wearing the expression of someone walking into a room they already know they should not be in. The archive chamber was enormous. Rows upon rows of data pillars stretched from floor to ceiling, each one pulsing with a faint bioluminescent light. A conclave storage format from roughly 300 years ago. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Trade logs, stellar cartography updates, routine diplomatic correspondence. I cataloged for 4 days. I found nothing unusual. On the 5th day I found the door. It was not really a door. It was a partition in the data architecture, a sealed subdirectory that did not appear on any of the station's navigation indices. The only reason I noticed it was because of a small inconsistency in the storage pillar's energy signature. Kun Vel told me it was probably a formatting error. I told him it was probably something interesting. He sighed. It took 11 days to break the encryption. Not because it was poorly designed, it was extraordinarily well designed, but because I had spent 3 years before this expedition studying conclave cryptographic architecture from the period in question, and I had built a decryption suite specifically for this class of lock. When the partition finally opened, I heard Kun Vel pull in a sharp breath behind me. I leaned forward to read the header text, and for a moment I did not breathe at all. The file was labeled, First Contact Incident, Human Vessels Classification, Omega. Below it, in 17 different languages, all of them ancient, all of them belonging to species that no longer existed in their original form, was a single repeated line of introductory text. My translation AI rendered it into plain language within seconds. It read, No fleet of the Conclave, the Dominion, or the Hive has ever fired upon a human vessel and survived to file a report. This document exists so that someone someday will understand why. I sat very still for a moment after reading that. Behind me, Kun Vel had gone the color of chalk. For a Thraxi, that shade means something specific. It is not fear exactly. It is the color they turn when they believe they are in the presence of something that should not be disturbed. He set down the scan unit. His voice was very quiet. Sarah, he said, please close it. I did not close it. I want to be clear about something. I am not reckless. People sometimes assume that because I spend my professional life breaking into sealed ruins and translating forbidden texts, I must be someone who does not think carefully about consequences. That is not true. I think about consequences constantly. I had thought about the consequences of this particular decision for 3 years before I arrived at Velacara, and my conclusion, based on the treaty frameworks I had read, the legal scholarship I had studied, and the precedents I had catalogued, was that I had every right to open it. The founding accords of the Galactic Conclave, Article 14, grants all registered sapient species the right to access any historical record that pertains to their own people. I am human. This record pertained to humans. The math, as far as I was concerned, was simple. What was not simple was what came next. The archive organized itself into chapters as I navigated deeper into the file. The first chapter was written in the first person. A personal account, a testimony, not a military report. The authorship tag identified the writer as Admiral Jet of the 4th Dominion Fleet, writing in a personal capacity approximately 180 years ago. Below his name was a note in Conclave administrative language, stating that Admiral Jet had, to the best of the Conclave's knowledge, been the only commanding officer in history to order an engagement against a human vessel, survive the experience, and then die peacefully of old age rather than as a direct result of that decision. The conclave considered this unusual enough to note. I scrolled to the first line of his account. He had written, "I am setting this down not because I believe anyone will read it in my lifetime, and not because I think it will change anything, but because I am old now, and I still have nights when I wake up thinking about that frigate. I need someone to understand what we saw, not what we feared, what we actually saw." I leaned closer to the screen. Kuhnvel spoke from the doorway behind me. He had backed up to the doorway at some point without my noticing. "I am going to wait outside," he said. "You can read it with me," I told him. There was a pause. "I would prefer," he said carefully, "not to." I kept reading. The chapter title loaded beneath the Admiral's introduction. It was 6 words long. I stared at those 6 words for what felt like a very long time. Then I reached for my recorder, started a new file, and spoke out loud to no one in particular, the way I always do when I find something that matters. "Day 16, I said. "Valkera Station, Outer Keth Expanse. I found it. Omega Archive is confirmed intact. First chapter title is The Battle of Gorath Station, How One Human Frigate Ended a War." I pressed record on the archive feed. I started reading. 180 years ago, in a region of space that the Dominion controlled and humanity was just beginning to explore, there was a small outpost called Gorath Station. It was not a military installation. It was a supply hub, a waypoint for colony ships, a refueling stop for merchant vessels, a place where 40,000 human colonists had set up homes, schools, medical centers, and the kind of small ordinary life that people build when they believe they are far enough from trouble to breathe easily. They were not far enough. The Dominion, at the time the second largest military power in the known galaxy, had decided that the Keth Expanse belonged to them, not because of treaty law, which was contested, and not because of any particular resource they needed, but because the Dominion operated on a principle that had served them for several thousand years. Space belongs to whoever is willing to enforce that claim. They had used this principle to absorb 11 civilizations. It had worked every time. They sent 400 warships to Gorath Station and delivered a simple message: "You have 6 hours to surrender unconditionally." After 6 hours, the station would be taken by force. The Dominion's fleet commander, a senior admiral named Jet, had done this before. The process was usually over in 2 hours. The target either surrendered or it was taken. There was no third option. There had never been a third option. The problem, the thing Jet would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to people who had not been there, was that there was only one vessel in range to respond, one ship, a mid-class human frigate called the Inexorable, running a standard patrol route 2 light hours from the station when Dominion forces arrived. 400 warships versus 1 frigate, a crew of 220 people. Jet's tactical intelligence calculated the probability of that single vessel causing meaningful resistance at approximately 0.0003%. He did not consider this a threat. He considered it a formality. The commander of the Inexorable was a woman named Caroline Oren. She was 34 years old. He had served in the United Nations Space Service for 9 years, held the rank of commander for 2 of those years, and had never commanded a vessel in open combat. When the Dominion fleet's transmission reached her bridge, she read it once. Then she called her crew to battle stations, opened a direct channel to Admiral Jet's flagship, and said the following: "You are in violation of United Nations Space Service Territorial Protocol, Section 9. You have 4 hours to withdraw your forces beyond the contested boundary." I will not repeat this warning. Jet wrote that he genuinely did not know what to do with that message. Not because it frightened him. He was careful to note, it did not frighten him, it confused him. His tactical staff ran the numbers again. 1 frigate, 4 hours, against 400 warships. The tactical staff could not find any logical framework in which that message made sense, and they were not certain whether to classify it as a bluff, a communication error, or evidence of some kind of severe cognitive malfunction on the part of the human commander. They decided it was a bluff. They continued their approach toward Gorath Station. Caroline Oren did not fight the way anyone expected. The Dominion's engagement models for small vessel combat were extremely well developed. They had been tested against dozens of different species, across hundreds of engagements. They understood how a small ship fights a large fleet. It picks targets, it runs, it tries to survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive or for a diplomatic solution to emerge. Every species did it this way. It was the rational approach. Caroline Oren did not do it this way. The first thing she did was contact Gorath Station directly and request an inventory of every piece of equipment on the station that was not bolted to the floor or otherwise immovable. The station administrator, a man named Peter Gillum who had spent 20 years managing colony logistics, sent her the list without asking why. 40 minutes later, 17 industrial mining drones that normally worked the asteroid belt at the edge of the system were reprogrammed and launched on intercept trajectories toward the Dominion fleet's advance formation. They were not armed. They were just very large, very dense objects moving at significant speed through the exact corridors the Dominion fleet needed to use for their approach. Jet had to redirect 3 cruisers and slow his advance by 47 minutes to deal with the drones. He was annoyed, but still not alarmed. It was a delay, not a threat. The second thing Oren did was more expensive. Gorath Station had a solar relay array, a set of large reflective panels used to channel energy from the local star to the station's power grid. Oren contacted the station's chief engineer, a woman named Paula Bright, and asked her if the array could be reversed, pointed outward rather than inward, aimed at the Dominion fleet sensor clusters instead of at the station. Paula Bright said it could, but doing so would knock out the station's primary power for approximately 6 hours. Oren asked how long it would take to do. Bright said 90 minutes. Oren said, "Please start now." The electromagnetic pulse from the reversed array was not powerful enough to destroy anything, but it disrupted the Dominion fleet's long-range sensor network for 4 hours and 19 minutes. During those 4 hours and 19 minutes, the Dominion fleet was effectively navigating blind beyond close range. Jet was now genuinely irritated. He pushed his advance formation forward more aggressively, trying to get close enough to the station that the sensor disruption would not matter. That was when Oren did the third thing, and this was the one that Jet would never fully get over for the rest of his life. 12 Dominion cruisers were forming up in a tight attack pattern, 300 kilometers from the Inexorable's position. It was a standard encirclement formation, designed to cut off retreat and maximize firing coverage. It worked, as Jet described it, like a fist closing around a smaller object. Nothing smaller than a destroyer-class vessel had ever escaped it. Oren did not try to escape it. She flew directly into it. She pointed the Inexorable at the center of the formation and accelerated. The 12 Dominion cruisers immediately had a problem that no tactical algorithm had ever been designed to solve. If they fired on the human frigate while it was inside their own formation, the energy dispersion from their own weapons would damage or destroy their own ships. The frigate was too close. She was inside them, threading between them, using their formation against them, accepting damage to her own hull in exchange for a position that made it impossible for them to engage her cleanly without hitting each other. For 9 minutes and 40 seconds, one human frigate maneuvered inside a formation of 12 Dominion cruisers, and they could not fire at it. Jet wrote, "We could not hit her without hitting ourselves. She knew this. She used this. I have commanded fleets for 60 years, and in 60 years I had never seen anything choose to place itself inside the weapon system of a fleet 400 times its size and use that position as a defense. She was not trying to win. She was trying to buy time, and she was buying it with the only currency that was available to her, which was the geometry of the situation, and her own willingness to take damage in exchange for that geometry." When the 12 cruisers finally managed to break formation to give themselves clean firing lines, the Inexorable broke away, and by then, Oren had used those 9 minutes and 40 seconds to relay targeting data from inside the formation to the station's remote systems. When she pulled clear, 4 of the 12 cruisers found their navigation systems locked into feedback loops, sourced from their own internal networks. Bright had been working on the exploit from the station's engineering bay the entire time. This went on for 72 hours. In 72 hours, the Inexorable disabled 61 Dominion vessels and destroyed 14. It took fire. It lost 11 crew members. Several sections of the hull were vented to space and then resealed with emergency foam by crew members working in full pressure suits. The ship's doctor, a quiet man named Owen Clark, performed 2 surgeries in a corridor because the medical bay had lost pressure. He performed them successfully. The cook repurposed the galley's industrial heating unit into a makeshift power relay to keep the engine room running when the main conduits were hit. The navigator, barely 22 years old, fresh from the academy, rerouted targeting data through the sensor array's backup system, using a technique that no manual had ever described because she invented it during the engagement. On the 73rd hour, Admiral Jet ordered his fleet to withdraw. He did not do it because he was losing. Technically, in terms of total vessel count and firepower, he was not losing. He had lost 75 ships out of 400, which was significant but not catastrophic. He could have continued. He had the numbers to continue. He ordered the withdrawal for a reason that he struggled for the rest of his life to put into clean language, a reason that was less tactical than, it was existential. He could not find the ceiling. In 60 years of fleet command, Jet had fought species that had a limit. Every rational combatant has a limit, a point at which the cost of continuing outweighs the goal being pursued, and retreat becomes the logical choice. He knew how to find those limits. He had built his career on finding them. But after 72 hours of watching the inexorable, watching its crew, watching a 34-year-old commander use drones and sunlight and geometry, and the inside of his own formation to keep 400 ships at bay, he could not find the limit. He did not know where it was. He did not know if it existed, he wrote. I ordered the withdrawal because I could not calculate when they would stop. I did not know if they would stop. I could not build a strategy around an opponent whose endpoint I could not model. And without that endpoint, there was no path forward that did not feel like reaching into a dark room. I have thought about this for 40 years. I still do not have a better answer. The Dominion never returned to Gorath Station. I set down my recorder after reading that section and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the archive chamber. 72 hours. One ship. The cook had helped. The 22-year-old navigator had invented a technique mid-battle because she needed it. The doctor had operated in a corridor. All of them had known the numbers. None of them had stopped. I picked up my recorder again. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Day 16 continued, I said. I think I understand why this file was sealed. It is not because of what the humans did. It is because of what Admiral Zet figured out about us. The thing he couldn't find. That's the part the Conclave didn't want in general circulation. I scrolled forward in the archive. There was more. A great deal more. The second section of the archive was not a battle record. That surprised me at first. After reading Jet's account of Gorath Station, I had expected more engagement reports, more fleet commanders writing in the careful, slightly shaken language of people trying to process something they had not expected. And there were more engagement records in the archive, yes, several of them. But the second major section was something different. It was a psychological and sociological study, commissioned by the Galactic Conclave's Central Intelligence Assembly, approximately 160 years ago. The Conclave had sent researchers to study humans after Gorath. Not soldiers, not diplomats, researchers, scientists. The same way you might send a biologist to study an animal that had done something unexpected in the field, not to engage it, but to understand it. I want to explain something about the Galactic Conclave, because it matters for understanding what came next. The Conclave is not a government in the way humans use that word. It is an agreement, a framework maintained by 14 elder species who have been interacting with each other long enough to develop shared expectations about how civilizations behave. One of the most fundamental of those expectations is that rational species, when confronted with impossible odds, will recognize them as impossible and act accordingly. This is not cowardice in the Conclave's framework. It is reason. It is the behavior that makes long-term coexistence possible, because it means conflicts reach natural endpoints. A civilization that understands when it has lost will eventually stop fighting, and a civilization that stops fighting can eventually negotiate. The Conclave's models for predicting the behavior of newly contacted species were built entirely on this assumption. The study team leader was a Velthari scientist named Sorath Vel. I noted, not without some irony, that the name was similar to the admiral who would later show up at my docking port, though the Velthari are a long-lived species and I cannot say whether they were related. The study was given an unremarkable administrative title that translated roughly as behavioral assessment. Human civilization, new contact classification. It ran for 12 years. The early sections of the report were almost comically diplomatic in their language. The researchers noted that humans displayed significantly higher pain tolerance thresholds than most known species. They noted that humans had an unusual relationship with risk assessment, specifically, that the standard deterrence models the Conclave used to predict whether a species would engage or stand down in a threatening situation, consistently, failed to predict human responses with any reliability above 40%. For context, the same models predicted the behavior of every other known species with an accuracy between 78 and 94%. What that meant in plain language was simple. The Conclave's experts could not reliably predict what a human would do when threatened. The report went deeper. Researchers had studied human historical records going back thousands of years, and they had found something that no one on the assessment team had encountered before in any other species in any galaxy. a consistent cultural pattern of celebrating the individual or group who succeeded against impossible odds, not merely recording such events as historical anomalies, not treating them as statistical outliers to be explained away, but actively venerating them, naming places after them, teaching them to children as aspirational models. The conclave's cultural framework had no equivalent concept. Success against impossible odds was, in the conclave's shared understanding, the definition of luck. A random event, not a template for behavior. The idea that you would hold it up as an example of what a person should aspire to replicate was, to the researchers, somewhere between baffling and alarming. There was a word they kept encountering in human records. The word was underdog. The study devoted 11 pages to this word. To the conclave researchers, the concept of the underdog was one of the most diagnostically important things they found in human culture, because of how humans used it. In every other species the conclave had contacted, the equivalent concept, the smaller, weaker party in a conflict, was treated with a mixture of pity and practical advice. Know your limits, find a negotiated exit, do not fight a battle you cannot win. The humans had built stories, songs, entire entertainment traditions around the idea that the underdog might win, not might survive, might win. And the humans did not treat these stories as pleasant fantasies. They treated them as evidence that it was worth trying. I paused on that section for a long time, not because it surprised me exactly. I grew up on those stories like everyone else. I just had never considered how they looked from the outside. The psychological section of the report introduced a term I had never encountered before: crisis neuroplasticity. The concept had been developed by a Hive collective scientist attached to the Joint Study Team. The Hive communicate and process information as a distributed network, and they have an extremely precise understanding of cognitive performance metrics across species. What their analysis of human physiological records showed was this: under conditions of acute, life-threatening stress, most known species demonstrated a measurable decline in higher-order cognitive function. Decision-making slowed, creativity narrowed, the mind focused on survival primitives and away from complex problem-solving. This was a well-documented, near-universal biological phenomenon. In humans, the data showed something different. Not in all humans, and not without variance, but consistently enough to be statistically significant. Human cognitive flexibility, the ability to form novel connections, to improvise, to invent solutions that did not exist before the problem presented itself, showed measurable improvement under conditions of extreme stress in a significant proportion of tested subjects. The Hive's term for this was crisis neuroplasticity. The Hive's classification for a species exhibiting this trait was Category 9 threat. There was a footnote attached to the classification. It noted that Category 9 was the highest classification level the Hive's threat assessment system contained, and that prior to the human study, it had never been assigned to any species. I read that footnote twice. The report then documented a second engagement, separate from Gorath Station, which had occurred approximately 150 years ago. A conclave military force, 12 warships, a standard interdiction patrol, had intercepted a convoy of 3 human merchant transport vessels in disputed space. The transports were not armed. They were carrying industrial cargo, chemicals, construction materials, pressurized gas containers, and mining equipment. The conclave patrol delivered the standard demand for the convoy to heave to and submit to inspection and detainment. The convoy commander, a merchant captain named Noel Barker, age 47, no military training, no combat record, acknowledged the transmission. The patrol fleet waited. 38 minutes passed. What happened next was documented in the conclave patrol's own battle logs, which had been obtained by the researchers. In those 38 minutes, the 3 human merchant vessels had done something remarkable. The exact technical process was outlined in the report, but the short version was this: using the industrial chemicals as propellant sources, the pressurized containers as projectile delivery systems, the mining equipment as targeting frameworks, and the convoy's shared navigation AI reprogrammed on the fly, the 3 unarmed transport ships built something. The report described it as a crude but functional area denial weapon system. The patrol fleet, upon resuming its approach, found itself navigating through a debris field that was not random. When 5 ships of the 12 attempted to push through, 3 were disabled and 2 were forced to break off with significant structural damage. The patrol commander called off the engagement. Noel Barker was never tried for the incident. The conclave determined that the engagement had been initiated by its own patrol, and that the merchant convoy had responded to a threat. The legal case went nowhere. But the incident was entered into the assessment report with a note from the research team that read, "The convoy commander had no military training. The improvised weapon system he and his crew assembled in 38 minutes, using cargo materials and a reprogrammed commercial navigation AI, caused more damage to a 12-ship Conclave interdiction patrol than 3/4 of the armed vessels the Conclave lost in formal engagements that same year. We do not know how to model this." The final section of the psychological report was the most striking. The Velthari team lead had included a personal field note, unusual for a formal study and possibly the reason this report had been sealed. He had conducted interviews with a group of human colonists on a frontier world as part of the sociological research. The colonists were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, engineers, parents. He had asked them about their relationship to risk and the possibility of failure. He had asked them, in various ways, what they did when a situation seemed unwinnable. He wrote, "The answers I received did not follow any pattern in my existing research framework. Most species, when describing an unwinnable situation, will describe the process of recognizing it as unwinnable and the steps taken to exit it or minimize the loss. The humans I spoke with did not do this. When I described hypothetical scenarios that were, by any statistical measure, unwinnable, the dominant response was not a plan for managed retreat. The dominant response was an alternative framing of what winning might look like. They would redefine the parameters. They would find a smaller victory inside the larger loss. They would talk about what might happen if the percentages were wrong." One individual, a farmer who grew food in difficult soil at the edge of a storm-prone region, told me about a concept she called a long shot. She said it with hope in her voice. She smiled. I sat with her on her porch watching the storm clouds come in, and I thought, "I do not understand this species," he concluded his note. "I do not mean that pejoratively. I mean it precisely. I am a scientist with 40 years of cross-species contact experience, and after 12 years of studying humans, I do not understand them. Not because they are irrational. They are not irrational. But their rationality includes a variable that the rest of us have never accounted for, and I am not certain we know how to account for it now." He never named the variable, but I thought I knew what he meant. I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the archive chamber for a while. Outside the station, the dead star's remnant cast a faint, cold light across the hull of the persistent question. And then the archive loaded its third section, and everything got considerably more serious. The classification stamp at the top of the new chapter was different from everything I had seen before. I had cracked Omega clearance to get into the archive. This section had a higher stamp. The header read, "Omega Eternal. Sealed by unanimous vote of the Galactic Conclave General Assembly. Reason for sealing: the incident at Meridian Gate." I heard the door behind me. Kuhn Vel had come back in, drawn by the change in the room's energy the way a careful person is drawn toward a sound that shouldn't be there. He read the classification stamp over my shoulder. Then, without a single word, he turned around and walked back out. I had never seen Kuhn Vel choose not to speak before. In 2 years of working together, I had never once seen him decide that silence was the better option. I turned back to the screen. I started reading. 80 years ago, in the deep lanes of the Keth Expanse, a conflict was burning that humanity had no part in. It was called the Keth Expansion War, which is a name that makes it sound cleaner and more defined than it was. In practice, it was a collapse. 4 civilizations pulling at the same piece of space, each one convinced they had the stronger claim, each one willing to spend ships and lives proving it. The Galactic Conclave had tried 3 times to broker a ceasefire. 3 times it had failed. The war had been running for 11 years and showed no sign of stopping. The Hive was the largest military power involved. They had committed more than 2,000 warships to the campaign, which is a number so large it becomes abstract when you read it. But if you were standing at the edge of a transit corridor and that fleet was moving toward you, it would not be abstract at all. It would fill the dark entirely. Meridian Gate was a transit corridor. It was the fastest route between the outer Keth Expanse and the Conclave's core worlds, a navigational choke point that cut weeks off any journey between the 2 regions, maintained and managed under an international framework that every Conclave signatory had agreed to. Humanity had managed Meridian Gate for 60 years, not because they had won that right in battle or because they had the largest presence in the region. They had neither. They managed it because they had been the first to build permanent infrastructure there, because the transit authority was logistically demanding work that most species found tedious, and because humans, it turned out, were very good at the particular combination of precision, patience, and adaptability that managing a major transit corridor required. The Hive's armada needed Meridian Gate. Their target was a conclave core world 3 weeks travel away on the far side of the corridor. If they went around, the journey was 14 weeks. If they went through, it was 3. The math was clear. The Hive Fleet's command collective calculated that the transit authority at Meridian Gate, 14 vessels, by their intelligence assessment, would respond to the Armada's arrival the way any rational force of 14 responds to 2,200, by moving aside. The fleet arrived at the edge of the Meridian Gate transit zone and sent a single transmission. It said, "Move or be destroyed." The Human Transit Authority commander at Meridian Gate was a man named Emeka Chukwu. He was 58 years old. He had served the United Nations Space Service for 31 years, the last 20 of which he had spent at or near Meridian Gate in various administrative and logistical roles. His rank was director, a logistics and management title, not a combat title. His career record contained not a single engagement, not a single entry in any combat registry, not a single line that would suggest he had ever expected to be in the situation he now found himself in. He read the Hive's transmission. Then he wrote a reply. It said, "You are in violation of the Meridian Gate Transit Accord, Article 7, Section 2, which prohibits the passage of military assets through this corridor without advance notice and authorization from the managing authority. You have 30 minutes to reverse course and exit the transit zone. Failure to do so will be treated as an act of aggression under the Accord's enforcement provisions." Director Emeka Chukwu, United Nations Space Service Transit Authority, Meridian Gate. The Hive's command collective processed this message. Their tactical assessment of 14 versus 2,200 came back exactly as expected. 4 minutes to neutralize. They began their approach. What happened in the next 4 hours and 17 minutes has been the subject of more study, more debate, and more quiet, anxious conversation among conclave military theorists than almost any other single event in recorded galactic history. And the thing that makes those 4 hours and 17 minutes extraordinary is not the violence of them. There was violence, but less than you might expect, and not the tactics, though the tactics were remarkable. The thing that makes it extraordinary is the reason behind everything that happened. Emeka Chukwu knew Meridian Gate. He had spent 20 years there. He had managed its supply chains, its maintenance schedules, its emergency protocols, its power routing, its docking sequences, its communications architecture, its structural engineering reports, its gravitational mapping, its debris management procedures, and about 300 other things that most people would find paralyzingly boring, and that he found simply familiar. He knew every gravitational eddy in the transit lane, the places where the corridor's natural geometry created currents that could push a vessel off course if the pilot was not watching carefully. He knew every sensor shadow, the angles and distances from which a ship could not be detected by the gate's monitoring systems until it was already inside the corridor structure. He knew every maintenance corridor, every emergency docking clamp, every power coupling, every override right switch and every junction box in the entire infrastructure of the gate. He did not have a battle plan. He said this later, under questioning, in a way that confused everyone listening. He said he had not planned it, that he had simply known the gate, and that knowing the gate told him what to do. When the Hive's advance formation entered the transit corridor, they entered it in the standard approach pattern that their tactical models prescribed for this class of engagement, a pattern designed to maximize coverage and minimize the response time of the defending force. What their tactical models did not account for was that the specific corridor, geometry of Meridian Gate, in the specific configuration it was in on that specific day, a configuration Chukwu had been tracking for 6 weeks, because a routine maintenance cycle had shifted 3 of the gate's large structural mass drivers slightly out of their standard positions, created a gravitational interference pattern in the corridor's midsection that would affect vessels above a certain mass threshold. 2,200 Hive warships were, individually and collectively, well above that threshold. Chukwu's 14 vessels were not. He did not create this. He did not engineer it. He had simply been paying attention for 20 years, and when the moment arrived, he knew where to put his ships and where not to put them. And the Hive's advance formation sailed into the midsection of the corridor, where the gravitational interference was strongest, and found that their navigation systems were fighting a current they had not modeled, and that Chukwu's ships, which had simply gotten out of the way and were sitting in the sensor shadows he had known about since his first year on the job, were precisely positioned to activate the corridor's emergency containment fields. The containment fields were designed to be used in the event of a catastrophic navigation failure, a ship losing control inside the corridor. To Prevent it from damaging the gate's structural elements. They had never been used as a weapon. They had never been designed as a weapon. When Chukwu activated them with the hive's advance formation inside the corridor's midsection, they did not fire at the hive ships. They simply closed. They closed around the corridor segment, creating a containment volume from which vessels above a certain mass threshold could not exit under their own power until the fields were deactivated. 800 hive warships were inside that segment when the fields closed. The remaining 1,400 ships of the hive armada were outside it, and they could not reach their trapped ships without entering the corridor themselves, which meant entering the same gravitational interference zone, which Chukwu's 14 ships were now positioned to make extremely costly. He had not attacked them. He had used the gate's own architecture to put them in a position where advancing further meant losing more of what they had already lost, and he had done it with a 14-ship transit authority that had no weapons beyond the standard defensive armament every UN vessel carried for asteroid deflection. The hive armada waited outside for 6 hours. Their internal calculations ran on loop. They could force the corridor. They could accept more losses. They could eventually overpower 14 ships, no matter what geometry those ships were using. But 800 of their vessels were trapped behind a containment field that Chukwu had made clear he would not deactivate without a full withdrawal, and every hour that passed was an hour in which the conclave core worlds they were targeting were mobilizing their own defenses. And every tactical model the Hive Collective ran kept returning the same answer. The situation is no longer the one we planned for. They withdrew. Emeka Chukwu deactivated the containment fields. The 800 trapped Hive vessels exited the corridor. No further engagement occurred. The Hive Armada turned around and left. The Keth expansion war eventually ended through negotiation, 4 years later, without the Conclave core worlds ever being attacked. The Conclave's sealed analysis of the Meridian Gate incident ran to 412 pages. I read every word. The conclusion of that analysis, the conclusion that the Conclave's full General Assembly had read and then voted unanimously to seal from public record, was contained in a single paragraph near the end. I will give it to you in plain language, as my translation AI rendered it. The paragraph read, "The Meridian Gate incident cannot be explained by attributing exceptional military ability to Director Chukwu or exceptional tactical genius to the United Nations Space Service. What happened at Meridian Gate was not the result of special training or special weaponry or special strategy. It was the result of one person having spent 20 years paying close attention to his environment, and then trusting his knowledge of that environment completely, without hesitation, when the situation required it. We have no countermeasure for this. We cannot train against institutional knowledge held by individuals who are willing to use it without the limit of rational self-preservation. If there is a human at every gate at every station, at every corridor in the regions where they operate, and there is, because they have been there, quietly, doing the work, for decades, then the only viable policy is one that does not require us to test what they know. That was the reason for the seal, not because humanity was secretly militaristic, not because of hidden weapons programs or covert fleet buildups, because of 20 years of a man paying attention to his job, and then, when 2,200 ships told him to move, deciding not to. I sat with that for a long time. Then I heard the docking alarm. Kuhnvel appeared in the doorway. He had gone chalk white again, he said, very quietly. They monitor every time that archive is accessed. I tried to tell you. 3 Conclave heavy cruisers had just entered the system. I want to be precise about the order of events because it matters. The docking alarm sounded. I read Kuhnvel's expression. I looked at the door. Then I looked back at the screen. I had approximately 90 seconds before the lead cruiser established a communication lock on the station's systems. I used those 90 seconds to do the only thing that made sense to me in that moment, which was to open the 3 secondary databases I had brought aboard the persistent question and start cross-referencing. This is what I do. Not fighting. Not running. Reading. Finding the thing in the structure of the situation that the other party has not accounted for. I have been doing it since I was a graduate student sitting in a university archive at 2 in the morning, chasing a footnote into a footnote into a footnote until I found the thing that changed everything. I did it then with a cup of cold coffee and a sense of growing excitement, and I did it now with 3 Conclave heavy cruisers outside and a somewhat terrified Thraxi scholar in my doorway, and the feeling was not entirely different. The communication lock engaged. The screen on the archive terminal shifted, and the face of a Velthari officer resolved out of the static. Tall, silver-skinned, with the deep-set eyes of a species that has been watching the galaxy for a very long time. His uniform carried the rank insignia of a full admiral. He was older than any Velthari I had met before, and the Velthari are already among the longest-lived species in the Conclave. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of someone who has given hard news many times and learned to deliver it without inflection. He said, "Director Voss, I am Admiral Sorath Khan of the Conclave's 7th Oversight Fleet. You have accessed a sealed Omega Eternal archive without authorization. You are required to surrender the archive data in its entirety, submit to detainment pending a Conclave Security Council review, and accompany my vessels to the nearest Conclave processing facility. This is not a negotiation." I looked at him for a moment. I had crossed 15 screens of cross-referenced treaty law in my 90 seconds of search. I had found what I was looking for on screen 11. I had confirmed it on screens 14 and 15. I took a breath. I said, "Admiral Sorath Khan, I appreciate the prompt response. I have a few points of procedural concern that I'd like to raise before we discuss logistics." He waited. His expression did not change. He had the patience of someone who had been alive for 4 centuries and was used to people trying to talk their way out of situations. He was not convinced that talking would work. I needed him to understand that I was not trying to talk my way out. I was trying to show him the door he had already walked through. I said, "The archive I accessed is designated Omega Eternal, classification applied by Conclave General Assembly resolution approximately 60 years ago. I have the resolution number. The grounds given for the classification were protection of sensitive military operational history. What the resolution did not include, and what I've confirmed by checking the original filing against the founding accords of the Galactic Conclave, is the required signature block under Article 14. Sorath Khan's expression shifted. It was a small shift, just a fractional stillness that replaced the patient waiting. But I noticed it because I had been watching for it. Article 14, I continued, grants all registered sapient species the unconditional right of access to any historical record held by the Conclave that pertains to their own people. An exception to Article 14 requires the counter-signature of the affected species' designated representative to the General Assembly, obtained prior to the classification being applied. The human representative to the General Assembly 60 years ago was a woman named Clara Ashton. Her signature is not on the resolution. The resolution is therefore not legally binding with respect to human access rights. The archive was never properly sealed against me. I gave him a moment with that. Then I said, "Which means I did not access a sealed archive without authorization. I accessed an improperly filed archive that the Conclave failed to seal in accordance with its own rules. And if you detain me for reading my own species' historical records that the Conclave sealed without our consent and without following its own required process, the resulting arbitration before the full General Assembly will require the complete contents of that archive to be entered into the public record as evidence, all of it, including the Meridian Gate analysis, including the psychological study findings, including everything the Conclave decided 60 years ago it did not want in general circulation." The silence on the other end of the communication lasted 43 seconds. I counted them. Behind me, I heard Kuhn Vel make a sound I had never heard him make before. It was a soft, involuntary sound, not quite a word in any language I knew. I turned to look at him. His expression was the most complicated thing I had ever seen on a Thraxi face. He was staring at me the way you stare at someone when you have just understood something about them that you should have understood much earlier. He said very quietly, "You knew, when you cracked the encryption. You knew it was monitored. You came here to be found." I did not answer him. On the screen, Sorath Khan had turned slightly to speak with someone off-screen. I caught fragments, the flat, compressed language of real-time legal consultation. His tactical officers, his advisors, whatever passed for his legal team on a heavy cruiser. They were doing the math. All of them were doing the math. I had handed them a problem that had no clean solution. They could proceed with detainment and trigger a public arbitration that would put everything in the archive on the record, or they could withdraw and accept that a human researcher had read everything, including the Meridian Gate analysis, and was now going to walk away with it. There was a third option, of course. There always is, in theory. But I had read the archive. I knew what they knew about us, and I knew that the Conclave's entire unspoken policy for the last 150 years had been built on the decision not to find out what happens when you back a human into a corner and take away the exit. Sorath Khan turned back to face the screen. His expression had settled into something I can only describe as professional resignation. The look of someone who has run the numbers. found that the numbers do not favor them, and is making peace with that fact in real time. He said, "The conclave will initiate a review of the archive's classification status in light of the procedural concerns you have raised. The review will take a standard administrative period. In the interim, we are not in a position to assert that the classification was properly applied." He paused. "The cruisers will withdraw." I said, "Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate the conclave's commitment to proper process." He looked at me for a long moment, and then something happened that I had not expected. The formal mask slipped, just slightly, just for a moment. He looked tired, not angry. Tired, in the way of someone who has spent a very long time managing a problem that doesn't have an easy solution, and who has just watched that problem sit down across from him and outread him on the relevant regulations. He said, "Dr. Voss, I have served the conclave for 400 years. I have dealt with representatives of every species in 3 galaxies. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Are all of you like this?" I thought about Caroline Oren inside the Dominion's formation, taking hull damage to buy 9 minutes and 40 seconds of geometry. I thought about Paula Bright working an electromagnetic exploit from a station, engineering bay while her home was under threat. I thought about Owen Clark operating in a corridor in a pressure suit. I thought about Noel Barker and his merchant crew, and 38 minutes and a pile of industrial chemicals. I thought about Emeka Chukwu and 20 years of paying attention, and 30 minutes and 800 trapped warships. I said, "No, we're all completely different. That's sort of the whole problem." He closed the channel. On the external monitor, I watched the 3 cruisers begin their withdrawal sequence. Their engine signatures brightened and then softened into the distance. The docking alarm cycled off. The station went quiet. Kunvel sat down on a storage case and put 2 of his 4 hands over his face. After a while he said, "You are genuinely one of the most unsettling people I have ever met." I said, "Thank you," he said. "That was not a compliment." I said, "I know I'm choosing to take it as one." I turned back to the archive screen 6 months later. After I had filed my full archaeological report with the University of Edinburgh and the Conclave's own records division, the classification on the archive was quietly revised. No announcement, no public statement, just a small administrative update in the Conclave's record system, reclassifying the file from Omega Eternal to Restricted, Historical, which is a category that academic researchers with the right credentials can access with a standard application form. I got a notification about it in my email inbox while I was eating breakfast on the station. I printed 1 page from the archive, a single paragraph from the end of Admiral Jet's original testimony. I had it framed and put it on the wall above my desk in my office at the university, where it has been ever since. Several colleagues have asked me about it. I always read it to them the same way Jet wrote it, without commentary, because it doesn't need any. It reads, "We did not retreat because we were afraid of their weapons. We retreated because we could not determine the ceiling of what they were willing to do. And without that ceiling, there is no strategy. There is only hope that they stop." He had written that 40 years after Goroth Station, near the end of his life, when he was old and honest, in the way that old people sometimes become when they have stopped worrying about how they sound. I do not know if he ever figured out the answer. I think he probably did eventually, sitting somewhere quiet, looking back across 60 years of command. The answer is that there is no ceiling. There never was one. We just keep going. Not because we are fearless. We feel fear the same as anyone. Not because we are stronger, or smarter, or built differently from every other species in the dark between the stars. It is because somewhere in our long, complicated, difficult history on a small world at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy, we learned something that did not translate into any other language the Conclave had ever encountered. We learned that the percentage on the board is not the percentage in the room, that the outcome is not decided until it is over, that the person who built their whole life knowing 1 gate, 1 corridor, 1 stretch of complicated ground, carries something inside that no fleet can measure. We learned to take the long shot. The galaxy remembers. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point.